Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending where you are on this fast forward planet, which is still wrapped in a pandemic. 3 years and change into that. It's turbulent politically, geopolitically, with the continuing war in Ukraine by Russia. It's a human heated planet. We're communicating in a polluted information environment. And that's just the start of a long list of issues. In the United States, particularly, there's a threat that I've been focused on for too long, as has Ian Livingston, who's here too, and everyone else you're going to talk to now, which is tornadoes. I've also written extensively about hurricanes, but tornadoes have been in the news a lot lately. You'll see how that's going, and the losses have declined dramatically. Human losses in hurricanes over the last century have reduced, but uh, the pattern is changing a little bit right now. There's so many people who have moved into tornado danger zones that the expanding bullseye of vulnerability and exposure is a real problem. I've got a great array of guests coming on today. Here are several of them, and Walker Ashley is coming back into the. Here's Walker, who hopefully you're. I'm going to mute you for a minute because I am hearing some feedback. So let's just get going on this. How do we live more safely in areas that are crowding, areas where there's substantial low income, sprawling development, where how can we have safer outcomes when these inevitable storms flow forward? And you'll meet the guests in a minute. This is video from when President Biden visited Mississippi, Rolling Fork, and I and Ian and other journalists have seen way too many photo ops like this. This is before the motorcade came, and there's something haunting about just the presidential podium being there over and over and over again. 2022, 2021 time, presidents have an increasing part of their job description is to appear and to hug people at zones like this. And now I'm going to show you a clip from 2014. Julie Rochman, who's here, worked for a long time leading the Insurance Institute for, oh boy, IBHS. Help me, Julie.
Insurance
Better?
Institute Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety.
Business and Home Safety, something that, and now you're at Smart Homes America as on the board there as you retired. Let me go from this clip, which, makes it feel like we're moving around from disaster zone to disaster zone. There's not a lot of discussion at those points of what caused the losses as opposed to the storm. And, and I realized that you can't hear. I'll just show this without the sound, although the sound is really extraordinary. So, Julie, tell us a little bit about, as this unfolds, I think
You want me to?
yeah, so this was 2014. We're going to talk here a lot about modern homes, manufactured homes, which are becoming a really substantial part of the building that happens, particularly, not just in tornado zones, up here in Maine and everywhere. What was the key impetus for this particular test? And, it shows remarkable. It's not surprising to see this, really, when you think about the force of these winds. But what prompted this, and what were the outcomes?
So we, like most people who look at the aftermath of disasters, we were kind of stunned by how often lower income, truly vulnerable people lose their lives or their property because they live in manufactured homes. And there are different standards for manufactured housing depending on where you live. So if you're near the coast, much like building codes for conventional homes, they're stronger and stricter when it comes to wind. In the middle of the country, the standards just aren't there. So if you're lucky enough to have what's called a zone 3 built manufactured home, then it can withstand winds if it's tied down on a permanent foundation every bit as well as a traditional wood frame home. But the vast majority of manufactured homes in this country are not zone 3 compliant. They're zone 1 or zone 2 compliant, which means they're basically, you can almost poke your finger through the outside of that box that is somebody's home. And they're not tied together, they're not anchored, and they blow apart. So we wanted to do something that was very visual just to show people why we keep seeing fatalities and massive property losses where people live in manufactured housing. It's not the people's fault, it's the house's fault.
Right. It sure, boy, it gets attention when you see what you're seeing here. Now, I know that a lot of, we'll talk about this more in a few minutes, but this clearly is something that keeps you up at night, right? Even though you're retired from your 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 job,
Job,
uh,
yeah.
uh, you see an unmet opportunity here. I think, is that right?
Yeah, because if all we did was to say that the zone 3 codes, the standards that those manufactured homes are built to, just need to apply everywhere, because it's not just coastal windstorms that impact this type of home. There are severe convective storms, straight line winds, derechos, on and on and on. Everybody deserves to have a safe home, regardless of how much money they make or where they live. And it is ridiculous that we allow substandard homes to be sold to young people, older people, economically marginal people. That's who's living in these homes. And it's just not right. So we would just love to see all the manufactured home people just go right to zone 3 boxes for everybody. It makes great sense.
And what would it take? Is that something ideally the industry would voluntarily do, or is this going to have to be legislated, or how does that
Like
happen?
like all things related to home construction, as soon as you add cost, the construction companies, whether it's in a factory built or site built, they lose their minds because you're going to add costs and they're going to say that'll make these homes unaffordable. There are grants that could be created. There are programs to retrofit to permanent foundations and to tie houses down. There are lots of things that we could do. I think just as the marketplace itself doesn't choose to do them, there is an opportunity for the government to step in, because HUD does regulate manufactured homes, and they could do a lot that would provide incentive to the marketplace to create better housing.
So that's a great initial prompt. Now let's get to some intros here of my other wonderful guests. Walker, I think, had popped back out, and I haven't heard from Steve Strader yet. So hopefully they'll come back on. Um, oh, and actually, someone from the manufactured home industry may be able to come on. Let me ask Daphne and Ian, introduce yourselves while I answer a text here, okay? Uh, Daphne Ledoux at University of Oklahoma. Tell us a little bit about what drives you when you think, well, you live in Oklahoma, but what drives you, what wakes you up or keeps you up at night when you're drives your scholarship and your work?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a senior research scientist here at the University of Oklahoma. I work for the Center for Analysis and Prediction of Storms. And I work on several different projects, but of topic today, my interest actually started with reading the FEMA report on the May 3rd, 1999 tornadoes that hit Oklahoma. I read it on an airplane coming back from a business trip, and I felt like I could vividly imagine how my house would fall apart, like what would happen first, second, third, etc. So I've had that interest for a very long time. And with the Vortex Southeast initiative that NOAA got going, I paired up with a wind engineer and a structural engineer to do some work where we paired them with the social science that I brought in, to talk to people about what they saw, heard, and felt when tornadoes came through. So I have talked to a few people who survived a tornado in a manufactured house. There are about 16 of our interviews were people in manufactured houses. And most of them were manufactured houses as opposed to mobile homes by the date of manufacture. One of them rolled in that house. But also, we talked to people in unanchored frame homes that also were, one of them was obliterated and he lost his sister who had been in the house. The other family was badly injured, but they were okay. They survived it. So anchoring is definitely one of the issues here, more so. It's not all about the box. The box is part of it, but it's not all about the box. So
Yeah.
Things that keep me up at night with tornadoes is honestly, most of us are not probably going to go somewhere else. So is the thing that we're in going to protect us enough that we survive it? That's what keeps me up at night. And there are just some really crazy, simple, critical flaws where a really nice home in Tennessee was, what they did with their anchor bolt was they stuck it in a concrete block with a little bit of mortar, but the concrete blocks weren't tied together. So there's just some crazy stuff out there that are simple, critical flaws in construction that if we can fix some of those issues, we can raise the bar on survivability quite a bit.
Boy, that's bringing to mind the discussions I've had over the years with earthquake engineers and safety, where simple little design elements in building a reinforced concrete structure, like columns in a building in Turkey, if you bend the rebar, the iron bar, a little bit differently, the building will stay up. If you don't, it'll fall down. So that sounds like there's a role for education, communication too. We'll get more to that. Hold on one second, because Steve Strader has shown up, and it looks like someone from the industry is going to join us, which is cool. Hold on one second while we, Ian, could you, actually, hold on, let me just, these shows are always, there's no producer behind the scene. There's no Wizard of Oz. It's just me. And here's Steve Strader, Villanova University. But Ian, let's get to you. You have an interesting history.
Sure.
Foreign policy, weather forecasting. You're now at Capital Weather Gang and the Washington Post.
Yeah,
you've been writing some of the most really data-driven coverage of what's going on with meteorologically and also, in terms of losses and stuff. So just a quick sketch of what keeps you up at night as a communicator thinking about all of this.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you again for the invite. I'm pretty excited just to listen to what everybody else has to say on this subject. I think from my angle, as you said, I'm not a traditional atmospheric scientist or an engineer. I actually found myself in DC following the policy world in foreign policy, as you noted. I think it just ended up that my true love of weather sort of won out in my interests over time. I was fortunate to connect up with folks at the Post. And as you said, I've sort of just become their data guy, more or less. Lived in Texas for a bit. I think that's where I sort of got the tornado itch, if that's the proper term. I, for a while, had imagined I was going to go to OU and all those various things, ended up on the East Coast. Like I said, the weather interest just stuck with me. I haven't been able to shake it. I've become better and better at data analysis, which certainly helps in the tornado realm. I think as far as what keeps me up at night, it's just my main goal, I think, in this sort of realm is to help ensure that the general population is getting education and the right information. And I know we're seeing a lot more directly from scientists on Twitter and all that kind of stuff, which is great. I think we need more of that, but it's also still helpful to have the intermediaries like us who, maybe don't know all the things ourselves. So we're still exploring as we go.
Yeah. By the way, I'm grateful to see this, a representative of the manufactured home industry is able to join us too. Let me go to this screen. Jim, thanks so much on completely short notice.
That's fine.
We're diving in. So tell us who you are, and we're going to continue the introductions. Basically, I'm asking folks, what keeps you up at night when you think about safe housing in tornado zones? That's where do we go from here? But introduce yourself. Tell us what you do at MH.
Great.
Hi.
Thank you, Andy. My name is Jim Ayotte. I'm the CEO of the Florida Manufactured Housing Association here in Tallahassee, Florida. We represent the factory-built housing industry in the state. And so a little bit of background here. Manufactured housing or factory-built housing represents about 12% of the single-family housing stock in the state. We have 9 home building plants. So we build manufactured homes, and we have plenty of manufactured housing communities here in the state of Florida as well. So we are very used to windy weather conditions such as hurricanes and also tornadoes.
Well, it's great that you could come on. I spent a lot of time in Florida as a kid. My grandparents lived there, and my parents lived in Stewart for a while. Actually, my parents moved back north after they had that. Stewart got hit by 3 hurricanes in one season. It's a tough environment down there.
It really is, and it's really kind of interesting as an industry. People say, well, manufactured housing, what is it? And so people say, well, so you're mobile homes, and we say, well, no, we haven't built a mobile home in this country since 1976. So as far as manufactured housing goes, after Hurricane Andrew came in 1992, that was a wake up call for the entire home building industry. And at that point, uh, the federal code was updated substantially to take into account higher wind standards as well. So what we're seeing here in Florida, from at least the hurricane perspective, is that homes that have been built since 1994 have performed extremely well. I mean, even Governor DeSantis was saying that after the Hurricane Ian in Fort Myers. But we have 830,000 mobile and manufactured homes in the state of Florida. And so about 1/3 of those homes were built to a building code that was not as stringent as it is today. And those homes are susceptible to high winds, no question about that.
That's a great point to throw past several people here. And let's bring in Walker and Steve. Walker, Ashley, and Steve Strader have been they're basically disaster geographers in a way. They're not just mapping the tornadoes and hurricanes, but the built environment that in regions that are prone to these events. And I know you guys have done extraordinary work showing that we're building an expanding bullseye. What's your sense of the data? Are there data on like the proportion of older mobile manufactured homes compared to new ones in these zones? Maybe Steve first, because you haven't. Steve and then Walker.
Yeah, so to answer your question, we do have some data back on manufactured homes prior to the changes that occurred between 1992 and 1994. But it's really hard to spot it's really hard to distinguish the difference between them on the ground. And then one of the things that we've done is we've tried to map individual manufactured homes as well as mobile homes after disasters to get a better sense of the types of homes. So unless you go into the parcel data, unless you go into the actual construction records, it's hard to get a hold of that data for large areas at fine spatial scale. So it's a bit of a challenge, but we do unfortunately see where the difference is between these two types of structures after the event when we look at where damage occurred and people lost their lives.
Yeah, and I'm showing one example of your mapping. This is from way back in 2020, where you see a track of a storm that could easily happen in any year, and what you see is the density of development in the same area, and that's this bullseye effect.
Yeah, I mean, the ironic part with that particular event is that there wasn't that many manufactured homes in the path. And one of the big things that we see is that sort of the further you get away from the southeast, you see that percentage drop quite a bit. And, we're not really picking on the manufactured homes that are along the coastline in places like Tallahassee, because the codes there are fairly strong, as Daphne mentioned. Mm-hmm. What we're really worried about are those that are in the most tornado-prone regions away from the coast. And again, to echo again Daphne's words here, is that it's not so much the structure that we're concerned about, but rather the anchoring to the ground. That's what we've seen has been a majority of deaths in manufactured homes have come from the structure failing where it meets the ground, not necessarily the actual box or the unit itself.
And I want to bring in your colleague Walker Ashley briefly, and then we'll get back to these questions about structure. Walker, you recently did you were the lead author on a paper on the potential role of climate change in shifting the hazard component of the expanding bullseye map. Areas that hadn't necessarily had tornadoes in their future may have them. But tell us a little bit about that and how important that might be.
Sure. Let me do a test.
Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm getting an echo. very difficult to hear myself twice, but I'm going to turn myself down a little bit. Yeah, so I think first and foremost, a cautionary tale there. Areas that are expected to see an increase in tornadoes are actually already hazard prone. In fact, the research that Stephen and I did a few years back that appeared in the Bulletin of American Meteorological Society revealed that if you look at EF1 plus tornadoes, totality across the United States, actually the Mid-South has a far greater risk than anywhere else. And so on collectively as a whole, the Mid-South has a 25% greater tornado footprint in those areas of the central part of the United States, which we colloquially call Tornado Alley. So it's important for people to understand that the risk in the Mid-South is actually some of the highest anywhere in the world. What's scary about the new research that we've presented is that area that is already very prone is expected to increase substantially as we go through the 21st century. In both sort of warming scenarios, we looked at an intermediate and we looked at a pessimistic warming scenario. In both cases, areas of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and Missouri are projected to, in some cases, see a doubling of supercells, which are the storms that produce the lion's share of significant tornadoes and hail across that area. So it's quite a scary projection as we move into the 21st century.
So I'm showing a graphic from your paper. I don't know if you can see on your screen, but maybe you could talk through. When you talk about the Mid-South, you're basically, I'm kind of indicating with my cursor, folks can see that.
Yeah, really just east of I-35, the Ozark Plateau, the Mid-South, Tennessee Valley, Lower Arkansas Valley are the areas that are already very prone and are expected to increase in terms of risk as we move into the 21st century. And as Stephen and others' research has illustrated, this is also socioeconomically the most vulnerable part of the country.
So you have growing population, vulnerability, and a change in the hazard at the same time.
Yeah, I always like to describe this as you have two die. You have one die is the risk, which we're loading with climate change. Every time we roll it, we're increasing the odds of an event occurring. And on the other die, we have vulnerability, which is, of course, multifaceted. Only one aspect of that is manufactured housing. There's a variety of things underneath that broad umbrella of vulnerability. But yes, Stephen, beautiful geographic distributions of socioeconomic vulnerability illustrate that the Mid-South has this very high peaked socioeconomic vulnerability. And you overlap those two in a Venn diagram sense, you're going to have more disasters in the future, more impactful disasters.
Unless there's some change in the housing options that are available for people who are of low income. And that takes us back to this discussion about housing quality and how much is the construction versus the installation. The Daphne, you mentioned some of those issues related to shortcuts or tie down. What you described, actually, I think Jim wasn't in the conversation yet when you described that one tie down that you saw that was sort of illustrative of the issue. Could you just repeat that so Jim could hear it?
I don't know if I'd articulated it quite this way, but the homes I saw that rolled were not strapped at all, although there were homes that had corroded straps that had obliterated, but I didn't talk to anybody who had been in one of those. So of the people I talked to, there was one person who was in a manufactured home that was actually strapped to concrete, and their home did not even shake. And they were kind of on the periphery of the tornado. So they weren't in the strongest winds anyway. But I talked to someone who rolled, and their home just had the Oliver Pan system underneath it. It wasn't actually anchored. Mm-hmm. That, as I understand it, is just for stability. And there's nothing that resists an uplift on the house. Their house rolled over.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, Julie, I'll get back to Jim in a second, but Julie, you were talking about, what can be done here. And I do want to focus on that. Some of this reminds me of other industries where, the responsibility ends in building a good product and putting it out there and someone buys it. But it can have problems afterwards. Is there some aspect of industry or the insurance side of things, as you were saying, can there be a stimulus to fill that gap? If is it not, if it's not regulatory, what can fill that gap of making sure the product is used right?
Well, so you're right. First of all, there's the manufacturing, the quality of the manufacturing itself. Second is where the house is sited. And third, is it on a permanent foundation or otherwise tied down, not just on a dry stack of cinder blocks? I'm looking at the picture you have up there. That doesn't look like a dry stack, but you see a lot of those in Florida where the tie downs aren't correct. What the insurance industry tried to do with our testing, and by the way, we worked with MHI, and they were terrific because they're interested in putting out good products. They recognize that our customers, as the insurance industry, and their customers, the home buyers, they're the same people, right? We all want to make them happy. We all want affordable, available, quality housing. We all want affordable, available, reliable insurance. And so working together, one of the things that the industry has done is to come up with what we call a fortified standard. There are fortified standards for site-built traditional homes, and there's fortified standards for commercial property. There's fortified standards for multifamily housing, and now there are fortified standards for manufactured homes, which take those three things into account: the quality of the construction, the location of the home, and whether or not it is installed correctly on a permanent foundation with anchors. One of the things that's really important that we discovered in our research and our work with the manufactured housing industry is that attached structures can also be a vulnerable point. If you have a carport or a porch sort of overhang that isn't also sufficiently anchored, that becomes basically a wing, can catch air. The uplift then basically rips the house open. It's not the house's fault, it's the attached structure's fault. And we've done testing in those areas too. So I do think, and I got to call out Palm Harbor Homes, which is in Florida, was the first factory to get a designation at the factory that they could in fact build fortified homes. And then it was just a matter of where they were put and how they were anchored and being on a permanent foundation. I don't think that anybody should look at this discussion as saying manufactured homes can't be safe. They certainly can be. And in some cases, if they're assembled correctly, sited correctly, anchored correctly, they will do as well or better than wood frame houses around them subjected to the same wind.
Yeah, maybe Jim could weigh in now.
Yeah, Julie, really good points. A couple things. So in Florida, back in 1999, we adopted a statewide installation standard. So it's uniform throughout the state. What we've found since then is that homes that were built to the post-94 construction standards and installed to the uniform 1999 installation standards, those homes perform extremely well. The vulnerability is it's older homes, and it's homes with carports. Carports are a major issue here in Florida, simply because they're just attached to the basically the soffit of the home, and so when the wind gets high, it rips off, it breaches the building envelope, and the home was destroyed. One thing that Florida has done, last year, the legislature appropriated $8 million to enhance tie downs, installation of mobile and manufactured homes in the state of Florida. So, and that program has been going on for 20 years now. So we're seeing some progress there. But the problem you run into with older homes, even if you install those homes securely, those homes were not substantial enough. And so I think it's like throwing good money after bad sometimes in high wind events. So the home is gone, but the frame is there. So I think we need to be judicious in how we allocate those resources. My thought is to find homes that were built in the 80s and 90s and go out there and make sure that they're installed properly, and also make sure that the carports are reinforced. They should be fourth wall construction. And I know Palm Harbor and a lot of other manufacturers do a great job with built-in host beams now as well, which is really important. So, those are some of the things that are going on. But when you look at really like Hurricane Alley, what we saw with the maps there, I'm not sure how many homes, if any, are really safe from tornadoes. If you start looking at substantial buildings, brick buildings that have been in existence for over 100 years, and you see them, substantially damaged or destroyed from a tornado. I'm not sure how much can be done. I think when it comes to hurricanes, I think we can easily, upgrade construction standards to address those. Tornadoes, though, and that seems to be a whole different animal. And I mean, I think if you're in that situation, you need to have a plan to get into a secured, Red Cross certified shelter where you can be safe, because you're looking at all kinds of houses. I mean, manufactured homes, mobile homes, site-built homes that are just completely obliterated because of tornadoes.
Yeah, this strikes me that you're talking about a sort of a systems approach where if there's a way to highlight areas of vulnerability, like Steve Strader has done, to map where you would want to have shelters within a certain radius.
Right.
To a big issue lately in the media has been sirens and cell phones, and not everybody has a smartphone. And so how do you make sure people are educated to know where to go? It isn't one or the other. It's all of these things. Steve, you've been dug in on this as so much as Steve and Daphne both. You really have a multidimensional approach to this. What comes to mind? That can be very paralytic, I guess, is what I'm saying. Having those X dimensions to a problem. What's a way for communities or architects or real estate developers or regulators to make progress when it seems so easy to just say, no, it's not this, it's that. Maybe
Well,
Steve and then Daphne.
I was kind of waiting for Julie to push back on the that you can't do anything on a frame home, because that's not true.
I'm showing the problem with these structures.
And when you think about like EF5 tornadoes, very, very little of that damage is actually EF4 or EF5 level damage. So even in the very rarest tornadoes, we really are looking at most of the damage being like the 90% of that damage is EF3 and less.
So it would have happened anyway, in other words.
So you can resist most of that. And even at EF5, let's not forget, Julie, because I know IVHS has done a lot of testing in fortified home.
Yeah, I agree. The goal for us really is not to eliminate all damage, but to narrow the scar, the damage path that a storm leaves, because Daphne's exactly right. Only 1% to 2% of tornadoes every year in this country are EF4s and 5s. And even in an EF4 or 5 tornado, if you look at the entire field, the path, a lot of the homes and other structures, businesses, government buildings were subjected to wind speeds that were EF1 or EF2. It's really, they take that since we're talking about bullseyes, they take the bullseye where the wind speeds are the worst, and that categorizes the whole storm. So we can definitely do things both for manufactured and site-built homes as well as commercial structures that can reinforce. Retrofitting is critical because, as Jim said, a lot of the homes out there, whether they're site-built or manufactured, are older. They're pre-code. So we have to also focus on what we can do to retrofit.
I am showing a scene that still haunts me from 2013, Moore, Oklahoma. I didn't take this picture. It was actually, I think it was FEMA. This was a little concrete shelter that sheltered a man and his child through that horrific, I think it's still categorized as F5, the Moore, Oklahoma storm. Ian, back to you as a reporter before we go forward with the next steps here. What comes to mind when we have Jim here and the disaster geographers? What questions pop into your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been, we had a huge, I just talked to Dr. Harold Brooks the other day for the article I wrote, and he pointed out how there was sort of a huge drop in tornado fatalities per million people. I think in the past, I guess probably 1875 to around the tri-state tornado, the average yearly rate was basically what 2011 was. And that sort of stuck with me. Mostly, I guess, I wonder if we've hit sort of a baseline where it's going to be a lot more difficult to sort of final, or to solve the final portion of tornado deaths and that kind of thing. And then also, obviously, with the increasing bullseye effect, is it inevitable that we're going to have bigger outbreaks killing more people? Well, not bigger outbreaks per se, although I guess that's also possible. But, like this last event, March 31, it had 100+ tornadoes. I think more than a dozen of them were killer tornadoes. I guess with the growing population, are we going to see more April 2011s, even without necessarily the overall violence? The March 31st event had, I believe, one violent tornado in Iowa, quite a few strong tornadoes, but it wasn't really necessarily on par with some of those massive, well-known forever outbreaks, but it still killed a lot of people, it seemed like.
Those are good points and questions. Maybe we'll just go down the roster here to see what people think. Is there? I think too. To me, this still comes down to geography. Like, if you could superimpose and identify in each state areas where there are old actual mobile homes from the 70s or manufactured homes from the 80s and 90s, and we have low income, like in Rolling Fork, Mississippi, and then zoom in and have a prioritization of opportunity in areas like that. Is that a way forward? Taking the data and putting those layers there and saying, wow, here's where they really need a tornado shelter and a radio. Here's where we can give subsidies to take off vulnerable add-on structures and put on something better. Is that out there? Is there someone pursuing this? Maybe Jim, and then Julie, and then the rest of you.
As I said, in Florida, we do have a program in place, to go in and resecure older homes. And that has been very helpful. But it's not the whole answer. I mean, it's not looking at where tornadoes are most prevalent. I think it's a multifaceted approach. I mean, I think you need to look at some areas and say, something, it's probably more cost effective to build tornado shelters that are easily accessible. Other places you may say, hey, something, we can invest some money and fortify those structures to make them safer. So I don't think there's a one size fits all approach. I think there's a lot of different ways that we need to be looking at. All we know is going forward, we need to make sure that all homes, whether they're factory built or site built, they're built more securely, they're more fortified going forward. The climate is changing. I mean, I've lived in Florida now for 17 years, and the hurricanes that we see here now are just incredible when you start looking. And it's we understand that we need to do better. We can do better as a building industry, and our newer homes need to be built to higher wind standards than older homes. That's just from experience.
Well, Steve, you've done a lot of work on Florida's bullseye. You were posting during the most recent storms. This issue of, is it new or worse now? As a reporter, I've learned to talk to scientists who dig in on past hurricane patterns, and there's plenty of evidence for Florida, particularly, that what we're seeing is resurgent lately, but not fundamentally new. It's just that it's new since Florida became a highly developed, densely populated state. Ian, I think you've reported on that too.
Yeah, somewhere probably in the past.
But Steve, what's your sense of the? I mean, that's almost like a rhetorical. It's kind of secondary to say, well, yeah, but there are periods in the past where Florida's hurricanes were at least as bad as now, given what needs to happen now on the ground. But it's worth knowing.
Yeah, I think that I want to back up for a second and talk about some of the issues of mitigation here. We did a study, Walker and myself, where we found that, a lot of people are saying, let's build community shelters. Let's have places for people to go. But That doesn't work in the Southeast. You have a majority, 80% or more of your manufactured home residents that don't live in manufactured home parks. That is not something you see in every part of the country. That is unique to the Southeast, which means you have people living 20, 30 minutes away from the nearest shelter. So we're telling people it's middle of the night, it's 2 a.m., you have your kids, maybe you have a disability, your car won't start, storm's moving 60 miles per hour, and we're asking you to get to your shelter that's 30 minutes away with a warning that's 13 minutes long. The odds are stacked against people from using those. And then we've talked to emergency managers, and they go, well, we would love to build a shelter, but we don't know where to put it. Well, the ideal place is in a community or an actual development, a manufactured home park. But that doesn't exist as much. I mean, they exist in the Southeast, but 20% of homes or 80% of homes aren't in those locations. And the money is not cheap. We also see barriers with people who during COVID, where the shelters were half, quarter capacity, pets weren't accepted. There's a lot of barriers that make people not take the proper sheltering. We're very good from a FEMA National Weather Service standpoint saying manufactured homes are death traps. Get out when the tornado comes. It's too late at that point. You have to take action at the watch when the actual watch comes out in the hours leading up to it. But that's a lot to ask of people as well, because they might be at work. Maybe they have other things going on that are more present, take precedent over everything. So there's a lot of issues. So I think that there's some geographical barriers to this that people think, oh, let's just magic pie in the sky solution for this. The biggest issue is money. Where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay for it? Good luck trying to get money out of any of these counties that were affected by these tornadoes in Mississippi over the last few weeks. They're broke. It's poverty, people without electricity, people without, running water. This is the reality of these people's lives. So that's the odds that we're up against, and that's the reality of it. And that's why we're all here.
And then we're back, I guess back to, well, Daphne, I'd like to hear from you on this too. You've talked to survivors. One thing I wanted to ask you all too is there good data on how many people own the home that they're in, the manufactured home they're in, or the mobile home, and how much are sort of rental, or where they don't have the actual impetus as an individual to do anything anyway? I don't know, Jim, do you know?
Yeah, I was going to say the vast majority of manufactured homes are owned and not rented. The newer trend we're seeing recently, because of the vast increases in real estate prices, is that we're seeing more rental units come online now. But that's a fairly new phenomenon, and it's pretty small amount. I'd say my guess would be, and this is purely a guess, 90+% of mobile and manufactured homes are owner occupied, and they're not rental units. They could be in a rental community where the land is rented, but the home is owned. Got it.
And Julie, are you keeping track of stats like this? That relates to the Smart Homes America approach. Who's the responsible entity?
Well, overwhelmingly, yeah, they're owned. And, a lot of these houses in rural areas, like I grew up in Nebraska, which is a different kind of rural and a different kind of poverty than Mississippi. But a lot of these homes are rural, and many of them are passed down, or you have like a family compound where there's more than one home, but they're overwhelmingly owned. And it isn't so much whether they're owned or rented. I agree. It's where they're located. Is there an opportunity for community shelter? Are you just talking about rural areas where, like, I live in New Mexico now, and if you go into Indian country, you're going to see a lot of manufactured homes, and it's a different kind of poverty. But we don't have the same sort of windstorms here. But I'd kind of like to go back to where we sort of started, which is Florida's doing great things. Florida has a tie-down program. Florida has good codes. Florida has code 3 boxes. They're in relatively good shape. The challenge, I think, for us as a nation, and where those bullseyes really fall, are not just in the middle South, but all the way up into the Midwest itself, where these tornadoes come through. And those states just aren't doing anything. They care more about the trees that are lost than they do about the homes that are lost, in many cases.
So who should I have on the next show to press them to confront some of these questions? In other words, who are the deciders, or is this at the level of state legislatures and governors, or is it?
I would love to see the equivalent of Jim somebody from Mississippi or Alabama or Ohio or Kentucky, Tennessee. Florida is a poster child for doing things right after Andrew. And I would say that is not the case. To go back on Julie's point, that is not the case across the United States. They're very distinct, very unique. And these vulnerabilities certainly do exist around other parts of the United States. And one cautionary tale is a frame-built house is not the same as a manufactured house. I'm sorry. As a person who's gone through a lot of damage patterns, it is not. Your chance of survivability in a frame-built house, writ large, is much greater than those in a manufactured house. I don't care of the age. So be very cautious in stating that it's an entire housing problem. As Daphne alluded to, F4, F5 winds are very rare. And yes, they certainly can wipe out frame-built housing. But it's a real rarity. And your chance of survival is far higher in a frame-built house than it is a manufactured house.
Walker, why would that be?
Well, you probably know well that these manufactured houses are made of weaker materials.
That is not true.
A frame-built house, a concrete foundation, is far different than something that is anchored, to the ground with stakes or whatever sort of anchoring structure it might have. Right. That is a far different sort of construction type than something that is frame-built.
So some of the building materials are stronger and different. Like you need, the manufactured home gets taken from one place to another. It has to be fairly lightweight. Like the doors tend to be hollow core because of that, which is pretty common in frame built homes too. So I swapped them all out because I heard emergency managers talk about fire and structures. So that's one of the things I did when I bought a house here. But I think some of those are some of the issues here. There's a different thing I would like to bring up, which is I talked to someone who replaced their home and they had the PAN system. And they thought, because of the way things are communicated, that was good. That was the standard, the 2012 Alabama standard. And I didn't know what to say to them because their home is not anchored. It just had a PAN system under it.
I do believe that the state of Alabama is looking at their installation requirements as well, which is a good thing. I'm not sure where they are in the process, but I mean, the home definitely has to be anchored, and if it's not anchored properly, it's just not going to perform the way it's intended to. There's no question about that. And I also think you need to look at different manufactured homes perform differently. I mean, earlier we talked about Palm Harbor homes and their fortified homes. I conduct a lot of factory tours at the Palm plant down in Plant City, Florida. I mean, those homes are incredible. I mean, 2x6 construction. I mean, double framed around doors and windows. I mean, unbelievably solid homes, but not every home builder builds to that substantial standard that Palm Harbor does. I mean, we have a handful of manufacturers in Florida that build really, really good homes. We have other manufacturers that will build to the HUD code, which is fine, but it is not reinforced the way some manufacturers are. I think that makes all the difference in the world as well. And you're right. I mean, I think, a larger home too, you do have the ability to find some more interior space to hunker down in. And that is a life-saving opportunity as well.
Is there some of the communication I've seen from some folks in the industry feels like it's going a little bit beyond the line in making the point about the safety of being in one home or the other. I don't know if it does seem to be a tangle in the ultimate question that Daphne raised about the foundation and the being attached to the earth securely and the like too. Could there be some way the industry can communicate more that any home needs these things to survive, for the people inside it to be safe? I guess that's the question.
Andy, this is a really great example of where this is one big game of telephone.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, what we do is we're told that the housing for manufactured housing is as strong as a permanent home. Then we're told, and we see firsthand after the tornado hits, that these homes don't perform and they get thrown. And it's an anchoring problem. It's an anchoring to the ground problem. We've seen that time and time again. It doesn't really matter. So the question is who's at fault? And we're not here to play the fault game. But the problem is that through the grapevine, from the time the home is built down to the person that builds it and the site installer and all of that, something gets lost here. And we end up with pan systems. We end up with weaker anchoring than we should. But the unfortunate reason is that the codes are not followed, nor are the codes strong enough for a majority of manufactured homes in these tornado-prone regions. Again, Florida is the poster child of what is a good anchoring system. But once you get away from the coast, you're left with the rest. And that's what we see happening in these people being killed. Some statistics that show how important manufactured homes are compared to permanent homes with tornado deaths is looking back to 1995, which is post, HUD changes and all of that. 72% of all tornado fatalities occur in homes, and 54% of those deaths occur in manufactured homes. You're 15 to 20 times more likely to be killed in these events. And then typically destruction of these manufactured homes occurs at 45% of the wind speeds. The same damage would occur to as permanent homes. So, for instance, we know that those are the facts. That's what we're seeing. That's what the statistics show. So there's something being lost down the line from the manufactured housing industry to the people purchasing it. And I think it has to do with the installation and anchoring systems. That's where I would put the culprit, and I would bet my entire paycheck on it.
Installation and anchoring. Julie, you want to?
I agree. I agree with Steve, but again, as long as the industry is selling zone 1 and zone 2 boxes, which are just, I'm sorry to use a very technical term, crap, compared to the zone 3s. I mean, when I go back to Nebraska and I talk to people about this issue, I always say, just ask Clayton Homes, it's owned by Warren Buffett. He's right there in Omaha. Ask them why they're not just selling zone 3 homes here.
Yeah.
Why are people in Florida getting better housing than people in Nebraska?
Yeah, Julie, your point is really well taken, because myself and David Roosh, who's worked with both Daphne and myself, wind structural engineer at Auburn University, we've both been asked by people when we're talking to them. They're like, what can I do? I live in a manufactured home. I want to build one. I want to buy one. And you know what we tell them? You need to make sure, pretend like you're in Florida, build to zone 3 requirements. Simple as that.
Well, one thing that needs to happen as well. So, I mean, we know where the tornado hot areas are. I mean, you map them out. What we need to be doing is looking at the wind zone maps for the HUD code, for the HUD manufactured home and construction standards, and map those out and figure out, okay, great. Do those need to be modified? There's two things that need to happen. Number one, we talked about making sure that homes in high wind areas, hurricanes, tornadoes, they're built to a stronger wind standard. And we need to make sure that every state does what Florida does. I mean, every installation, we have a uniform installation standard. Every installation is inspected by local government to make sure that it complies with the state standard. I mean, that's important, to have someone going out there and making sure it's done right. Because without that accountability, people tend to get lax, and they say, oh, I can save some money by doing it this way as well. So, I mean, I just think it's a matter of, we know what needs to be done. It's a matter of the industry stepping up in areas where we're not currently stepping up, and making sure that we put a plan in place where there's accountability. And I think that's not the total solution, but that's a major step in the right direction.
I have a question. Are the feds doing anything about this? It seems like leaving it up to the states isn't working. I know a lot of these states are probably somewhat resistant to federal assistance, especially these days. But is this something that's even on the radar of policymakers in DC?
Right. So the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development requires that manufactured homes be installed to the manufacturer's instructions. So they require that, and then a lot of times, then they defer to the states. They say, okay, state, you can be responsible for this. And I think what we need to happen is the state needs to be responsible for that. They need a plan for that. So I think at the federal level, there are requirements in place. Now it comes out down to the state level to make sure that those requirements are being followed.
And that gets back to what Steve and dropping the ball. Did I freeze there? I'm on that Starlink system.
Right.
I was saying,
I think so.
Right.
So if it's state, sorry.
Yes, because in the same thing in Florida, and we looked at Hurricane Michael that came into the Panhandle as well. 150-mile-an-hour winds. Guess what? I mean, site-built homes and factory-built homes, they weren't really built to that. What needs to happen after that? Oh, that's a vulnerability. We need to look at the wind code, and we need to make sure that those wind requirements in that area are elevated. So future homes that are built, replacement homes, are going to be built to higher wind standards because we know that that's a possibility.
Sounds like a discussion that I should have with some folks at the federal level too. I guess part of this may be that the federal government is not well situated to shift things from response to a tornado disaster to prevention mitigation. I had Deanne Criswell, the FEMA administrator, on here last year. We were talking mainly about fire risk, but it seems so hard at the federal level to get the funding torqued toward the prevention, toward mitigation, toward these issues. I don't know how much of this is a result of that as well. We have a reactive system. It's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, not the Federal Emergency Mitigation Agency.
It's true, but FEMA and HUD are starting to require, when people use disaster recovery dollars in certain areas, they have stipulated that where they're rebuilding or replacing housing stock, they need to do it to the IBHS's fortified standard. So they're trying to build in some incentives. I don't think they're doing that with manufactured housing yet, but they're kind of stepping their toe in to say, why are we keep putting the same brittle pieces back in the same vulnerable places that are exposed to the same hazards again and again? Maybe, I don't know, we break that cycle of destruction and we require people to rebuild and put the pieces back better and stronger and safer.
In what we are seeing in the rebuilds down in the Southwest Florida, the Naples, Fort Myers area, all those homes that are being rebuilt there are more substantial because they're newer, and they're also being elevated. I mean, they're being elevated, base flood elevation plus at least 1 foot. And they are being secured because a lot of those now are being sited on pier systems because they need to be in order to get the elevation that FEMA requires. So it works, but the problem you're running into is it's after the fact. I mean, these are replacement homes that were destroyed. So.
Yeah, and Ian's reporting and Walker Ashley's research and Steve's shows that a responsive, reactive approach is not going to do it. If we already know where the building is happening, where settling is happening, where there are zones of deep social vulnerability, that just isn't. And also, I've written about this again in the context of earthquakes. Does every place have to have its earthquake for the community to really get ahead of the problem afterwards? Pacific Northwest versus California. I just did a show here 2 months ago on the 35th an anniversary of the 1933 Long Beach earthquake that woke up California. But the Northwest, Washington State, Oregon are still way behind the curve. They face a worse earthquake risk. So I guess I'm really happy you were all able to come on. I think we could go on for a longer period here, but what I'd love to do is sort of assess what we learned so far here and maybe schedule a follow-up conversation to take it a little further, if that's okay. I'd like to have each of you, if you're okay with that, just sort of give your thumbnail. Where do we go from here? Who could be in the conversation to make a difference? Where are these best case examples, as you just mentioned, Jim? How do we propagate them where the worst case is most likely? Ian and the rest. So just a quick final, go-to thought. What's next here? And then I'd be really grateful if we can kind of do another show. Daphne, to you.
Okay, so Dr. Cassandra Shivers Williams and I, that was something you tweeted about. We did a second study, and we are still just starting to analyze that data, but a lot of people don't really know what's under their home. So we even had pictures, because we knew people probably didn't know pan and anchors. And so we had a picture of a pan and an anchor, and 117 people said they didn't know if they had a pan. Out of the 200, it's over half. A good, not quite half, almost half, didn't know if they were anchored. So I think there's an education something in there that people don't know a whole lot about how their manufactured home is installed. Just in general, especially when you're talking about people that don't have a lot of means, which can just mean a lot of things. Somebody like me, but I'm retired now, middle class. It doesn't have to always be really low socioeconomic. Blue collar workers. Can we get more DIY information out there that's just clean and easy to understand? In a lot of places like Alabama, there are a lot of places with no codes, and I could go and make my own house, but do I have any clue how to anchor it? Well, so Simpson Strong Tie has some stuff out there, but I'd love to see a lot more that's just really simple and easy to understand. You don't have to have an engineering degree. I think that would be a way that we could get the bar of resilience going up. In the future discussions, I'd love to see you bring in things like the National Windstorm Impact Reduction Program, because there is a congressional mandated program to try to raise the bar on resilience in the U.S.
That's great. Those are two really good examples. And by the way, before we just close this out, I did see a question that came in. Jan Carson Weatherby says, why not 3D printed homes built on foundations? In other words, is there a prospect for the industry to take this to a new level where the components are not in a factory, but you're building a house where the foundational elements are really part of the same thing? Maybe, Jim, is that something in the future?
Yeah, we have not been involved with 3D printed homes, but yeah, I think we need to be looking at all kinds of different alternative construction methodology in order to build safer homes. What I would suggest in the future too is to bring in, I'm fortunate to live in Florida, where we have a robust, regulatory system in place here. But I would suggest bring in colleagues from my industry from Alabama and Mississippi, and talk to them and see what they're doing and what their perspective is. One thing that's always a concern, because manufactured housing, we are affordable housing. That's what we are. We can build homes more efficiently in factories. People rely on us because we are a lower priced housing option. But there's a trade-off. You look at affordability versus whatever, and we can elevate homes and we can fortify homes, but you get to the point is we have our affordable housing crisis here in the country. How do you balance those interests? And that's a real tough one as well. But I would suggest bring in my state colleagues from the tornado-prone areas, as well as grab some emergency management officials from those areas as well. What are they doing? As well, because that's an issue there. And they need to be, if they're not on it, they need to be on it as well. And talk about, hey, are you planning to do, a uniform installation standard for manufactured homes in the state? And if you are, what does that look like? And what do you do with the older housing inventory that's vulnerable? Is there something? Can you find some money to throw at that as well to at least make them more secure? So I think they could bring a whole different perspective than I do.
That sounds good. And Julie, and then Ian has the closing thought.
I would just second what Daphne and Jim said. I think there's a lot of good work being done in academia, and there's a lot of good work being done in industry, and the government needs to step up more actively than they have been. Although, as I said, they're sort of getting into this business on the site-built homes. I want to just address the question about 3D printed homes real quick. There are 3D printed homes being built, and of course the materials matter. ICF and other things, different forms of concrete can be used, but it's not just the foundation. I want to be real clear that a house, whether it's factory built or site built, is a system, And it's not, we've talked a lot about the foundation because for manufactured homes, it's particularly important since they are moved and placed. But roofs have to be tied to walls. Walls have to be tied to each other. And then the bottom of those walls need to be tied to a permanent foundation. Doesn't matter what your home is built out of. It could be the latest polymer 3D printing, could be ICF, could be wood frame, doesn't matter. All of those homes will stand or fail as a system. And Mother Nature has an incredible knack for finding the weakest link and exploiting that. And then you have a cascading chain of failure from there. So I just want to be real clear, not just foundations. Foundations are critically important, but roofs are actually the first line of defense for any structure.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe in a later conversation, we can talk about roofs as well.
Yeah, and there was another comment that came in from Dave McNally. In addition to anchoring, shouldn't homes or at least a room be resistant to windblown debris? So safe room, maybe Jim, I don't know if are safe rooms a basic component that should be in every manufactured home in a zone of danger?
I mean, they're not currently. Obviously, it would help if you had a substantially framed interior room that you can hunker down in as well. What we see in Florida quite a bit, and I'm sure you're aware of this, is concrete block homes as well. And
right.
Talk about being safe. I mean, those things are definitely fortresses. When you get in there, you can't hear a thing, and you feel real secure. But again, that's not a factory-built home. Those are built on site. But we're seeing more and more of those built in South Florida.
Right. Well, Ian, a last thought from you before you get back to your actual work. It's great that you could spend time here. I think as a reporter, I know I heard a lot that I got to follow up on. I assume you've been.
Yeah, I think I got lost in just listening a little bit.
That's good.
All the responses here were fantastic. I think, and as you alluded to, I think many of these things are connected to more proactivity versus always being reactionary to everything. That's not just a tornado world problem. That's sort of a thing Americans or maybe everyone in the world has a problem with, but us particularly. Also just more federal policy. I have to go back to that. It feels like we spend most or all of our time on climate change, which is interconnected, but we do have all these massive weather disasters left and right as climate change accelerates. So it just seems like for some reason there's not a whole lot of focus just on the weather aspect.
Yeah, that reminds me of one thing I want to do another show on, which is the need for a national disaster safety board, kind of like the NTSB for aviation. A number of people I've talked to for years, this could help because you could go to an area like Rolling Fork, look more carefully at what broke and what didn't, look at those aspects of losses, and again build a government prioritization that is ahead of the game. Thanks everyone for being here, and I hope we can come back and revisit this, and feel free to. Jim, I'm really glad that Molly connected us and you could come on. I know, it's a hard world out there. We live in a sort of A versus B media world. Yeah. And I try to break that pattern here on Sustain What. This is my Columbia Climate School webcast where we dive into the complexity with where it's consequential and come up with some solution pathways and get around the sort of hero villain aspects of things. Thank you, everyone. And everything you said, by the way, Julie, what you said about a whole home approach is what I reported on extensively in wildfire country. All it takes is one soffit vent without a screen and your nice structure will burn down. And it's the same thing with debris. If the home next to you falls apart, whether it's manufactured or not, you're throwing debris at the house next to it and the house next to it and the house next to it. Same thing with firebrands. Sadly, Boulder County, the fire out there, I reported on so much. All it takes is one house to catch on fire and a whole community can go down. So thanks again, everyone here and those who had to leave early, Steve and Walker. And let's do more. This gets shareable right away. As soon as we're done, you can share the YouTube video, the Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And folks can get in touch with me to follow up using that distracting scrolling bar at the bottom. This is Andy Revkin from the Columbia Climate School, and I'm going to sign off. And I really appreciate your time, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
This is great. And I'm going to show something related to the National Disaster Safety Board. Sam Montano, it has, she and Scott Knowles and others are pushing this idea. And disaster justice, just one last thought too. This is this idea that people who are socially marginalized, building more of a sense that this is not like an act of God or just some weird coincidence. There's structural issues here to pursue. If that can become a movement, then maybe in states where there's inaction, there can be more action. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.